I'm going to make a bold claim. The time of new icons is potentially coming to an end. I'll explain why, but let's start with what it takes to become an icon. Let's dive in. Calling a watch an icon inevitably gets you into a battle with enthusiasts. Does it have to be the first of something to become an icon? Is longevity in itself enough for iconic status? How much time has to go by before you can call something an icon? The first thing that defines an icon's status is the brand perception. Simple as. A Patek Philippe Nautilus has more of an iconic status, in part because Patek Philippe has more of an iconic status. Vacheron Constantin is part of the Holy Trinity. They were founded first, but the Nautilus is by far more desirable than an overseas. When a big brand, a story brand, launches something new, there is always a risk that it gets met with the reception of the 1159 or the Cubitus. But when the strongest brands in terms of perception do a good thing, they have a massive head start in terms of taking the mantle of the icon maker. Brands like Rolex, AP, Patek, whether we like it or not, have been successful at steering their companies successfully for decades, and that imbues on them an aura of superiority which transfers onto how their watches are generally perceived. Next up, icons tend to be boring. Hear me out. That's a very loaded statement, I know. But why is the Submariner more popular than a Seamaster 300M? What about the Nautilus over a Moses Streamliner? What about a Seiko SKX or 622 MAS over a Doxa 300? A lot of those watches are priced similarly and compete on specs and materials and quality. But the difference is simplicity. The more simple, basic, or unassuming your watch is, the more likely more people will like it. And if more people like it, the more people will buy it. And it becomes the reference point on which all other similar products are compared to. A Mercedes C-Class, a BMW 3 Series, and Audi A4 are visually the most nondescript, non-unique cars in the world. They are literally just good cars for mid-level managers. Taylor Swift is not edgy or niche. She makes good music that is appealing to many people. And a Submariner is an icon in part because it has design cues that allow for it to be appealing to a very broad audience. It's often called a boring black diver. But boring black divers are versatile and they work in any situation and they don't imbue some weird sort of values onto the wearer. A studio underdog, goofy panda or watermelon potentially says a ton about the owner. The Submariner says nothing. I'd even go so far as to say that Rolex over the years have refined the sub to be precisely as generically appealing as possible. It's the quintessential good diver. And so is a Nautilus or a Royal Oak in their category. Icons or watches that aspire to that kind of status tend to be not too out there because part of their appeal is being, relatively speaking, massively appealing. And in part, that's also why they are emulated and copied and homaged, because the design works at a core level. No current studio underdog watch will ever become an icon. And it's in part because Studio Underdog are built around novelty, interest, drops, and contemporary tastes. If you want to have an icon in your lineup, you have to stick with your design for a very long time and trust in it. Gerald Genta made a lot of watches, but of the Pole Router, the Nautilus, the Royal Oak, and the Ingenieur, it's the Nautilus and the Royal Oak that I would argue hold a stronger level of iconic status compared to the Pole Router or the Ingenieur. The Pole Router doesn't have that same level of icon status because the Universal Geneve brand disappeared off the map for decades. And the Ingenieur, IWC messed around with the design for decades, which cost on consistency. They didn't stick to it, and that showed to many people a lack of belief in the product, which hurt the iconic status. You stick with your design, you refine it, you don't change it. And mark my words, the 1159 might end up being an icon someday. If you are new to my channel, I hope you consider sticking around, and the best way to stick around is clicking the subscribe button so you are reminded whenever I put out a new video. On this channel, I talk about watches, the watches that I love, the watches that I don't. I am unbiased, I'm in nobody's pocket, and I just talk about it in a fun and enjoyable way. Hopefully you'll stick around. Please subscribe. Thanks. We are also just the most gullible dimwits out there. If some famous person that we like has worn a watch, we're going to like it more. Simple as. The Omega Seamaster 300M is close to an icon, among other things, because it's so closely associated with James Bond. Honestly, if it wasn't for James Bond, I don't think a watch with a 10 o'clock wart would be as popular as it has become. The Speedmaster isn't the only watch that has been in space, but it's the one people reference. Steve McQueen, Tag Heuer Monaco, Paul Newman, Daytona, American presidents, the day date. Would the Radiomir be a potential icon without Sylvester Stallone and the movie Daylight? I honestly don't think so. Some watches were close. Pretty much any watch worn by Jacques Cousteau. Universal Geneve really pushed the Nina Rindt, and both Andy Warhol and Muhammad Ali wore a Cartier tank. But not all, and that's my point, get the status because of that. Pharrell can wear as many reshot meals as he wants. The individual watches are never going to be true icons. The cultural significance of a watch is more than which popular person at the time wore it. Today, everything is overtly sponsored and products are placed strategically at shows and galas and all that kind of stuff. And that may make some watches popular for a period of time, but that coolness imbued on the Daytona from Paul Newman is just incredibly hard to replicate. When it comes across as authentic and honest and the watch matches the picture we have of the person or the event, then we start dipping our toes in icon territory. An icon needs to be a good watch. It has to be aesthetically something people approve of. Rolex can't just throw out a model and proclaim it an icon. Neither can Omega, Patek, or AP. The Cubitus is so far considered a flop. It's nowhere near as desirable as expected, and it has just completely failed to capture the imagination of the world. It's a really decent square Nautilus, and it's just not enough. Some of it is just plain dumb luck. The Chevy Corvair is a car I believe should be considered an icon, but it generally isn't considered one. You could argue that the Daytona became popular in part because of all the things that happened to Rolex. Rolex kept production low. Oversupply was never an issue, and that meant it ended up being in demand. Paul Newman wore it. Rolex stuck to it, and they revised it. Rolex also became desirable. There are probably so many situations where a board of directors could have given up, but they kept it in the catalogue, and in part, it's sheer luck or confluence of non-Daytona product-related events that helped it achieve iconic status. Just like it matters who might have worn the watch, the time around the watch's release and the watch's significance in that time plays in. Dive watch icons like the Sub, the 50 Fathoms, Doxa, many of them saw the light of day at a time where diving and scuba and undersea exploration were the biggest thing. It's by definition going to be hard to make a future iconic dive watch today. It's also going to be hard to make a future space or moon watch today. Integrated bracelet watches that are iconic to some extent today, like the Nautilus, the Vacheron 222, the Royal Oak, all saw the light of day in the 70s, and they very much defined a generation of watches. Bell bottoms and integrated bracelets were a thing at more or less the same time. What I'm going to claim now, and it's bold to say the least, but the Hublot Classic Fusions or Big Bangs could, at least in terms of how they were indicative of the time they were released in, eventually become considered icons. And I know Nico's going to shiver just thinking about that. Lastly, risk. Rolex Daytona. It was a response from Rolex to the Speedy from Omega and watches from Zenith. Commercially, they had to do something. The Nautilus, the Royal Oak, the Engineer were also to some degree Hail Marys for companies that didn't have a product in their lineup that spoke to the customers of the day. The quartz crisis could have killed the industry, but it was that willingness to take risk and just throw something out there that led to some of the most recognizable, desirable, and iconic watches we know today. All of those reasons, perception, segment dominance, longevity, cultural significance, luck, trends, and more than anything, risk are why I think there will be fewer and fewer icons from here on forward. First, with pretty much any watch category, there are one or two watches that define the category. Dive watch, Submariner. Integrated bracelet, probably the Nautilus or Royal Oak. Chronograph, Speedy. Pilot's watch, it's a big Pilot or a Mark series from IWC. Square dress watch, Reverso or Cartier Tank. Where's the space for yet another watch that looks good but is fundamentally a variation of an existing theme with an existing icon or set of icons? What watch can take the mantle of the Blancpain 50 Fathoms? A Ulysse Nardin Air? Sorry, no. It's a great watch, but the 50 was there already. There's even a musical precedent for this. What today is at Christmas the most listened to Christmas song? Usually it's either Last Christmas from Wham or All I Want for Christmas Is You by Mariah Carey. Go back 30 years and every year bands would launch their Christmas song in the hope of having a seasonal hit. But with the advent of streaming services like Spotify, new Christmas songs take a backseat to easily accessible, easily remembered hits. All I Want for Christmas just trounces any new Christmas song consistently, simply because it's what shows up first in the search terms. Second, almost everything today is scripted. When Omega in the 90s threw the Seamaster on the wrist of superstars, including Pierce Brosnan, that was a relatively novel idea. Today, every single watch at the Met Gala, the Oscars, Cannes Film Festival, and probably even Comic-Con are sponsored and placed. A moment like the one where Brad Pitt was caught wearing an original Vacheron 222 is exceptionally rare. In a world where nobody sits down on a Thursday at 7 p.m. to watch this week's episode of Magnum PI, Friends, or The West Wing just leads to a situation where it's incredibly unlikely that one specific watch will capture a generation's imagination in the way a Speedmaster has. So few watches have the power to be part of the cultural zeitgeist these days in a much more fragmented world. And third, longevity and trend. Drop culture is counterproductive to the creation of icons. We binge on the latest hyper-desirable product and we move on. And as manufacturers, the focus is on the immediate hype, the release day demand, not the long-term interest. IFL watches are a brand that live entirely on creating a release that is a one-time thing, capitalizing on it and then moving on. Everything is trend, and trend is short-lived. I've spoken to quite a few brands by now, and they basically all admit that much of their innovation is about seasonality, which basically boils down to things like dial variations. It's cheaper than coming up with a new product, and it's just like clothing trends. They think for a season and then move on to something else the next year. This doesn't bode well for longevity and consistency. And finally, it's risk. How often these days do you see brands really taking a risk or throwing some sort of Hail Mary? The fact is, they don't. They stick with what works because when you have a revenue of a couple of $1 billion, there's no reason to rock the boat. You also stick with what works and you pull out old designs and hope they have some traction. The willingness to throw caution to the wind and also stick with it over time, refining until the product hits the mark, just isn't there to the same extent. My list of potential icons is very, very short. It's watches like the Lange Zeitwerk, maybe an MB&F Legacy Machine, or maybe an Octo Finissimo. I don't see a Black Bay 58 hitting the mark. Neither do I see a Tissot PRX. The 1159 is just not there yet, and a Cubitus has a very, very, very long way to go. Not that those watches won't be around, not that they're not good. Many of them are, but that perfect storm of time and place and story and willingness to take risk is becoming more and more rare. Those are my thoughts. Share yours in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.